Since we have so many questions that students have submitted previously and others that you can feel free to add in the chat box as we speak, I want to dive right into asking you the questions. Know that this session is recorded, and for those who missed the session, we'll be able to share the recording later on. But glad you can join us in person. So let me ask you first, and I'll ask one of you and both of you for some questions. Susan, can you just help us understand what the role or the difference is between a recruiter and a hiring manager? When I first apply on a website, what is the pipeline? Who sees my application first?
And thank you for the warm welcome. So our process with Kelly at the NIH, when people do apply for the positions,
Susan, hold on, you're muted for some reason. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And so I didn't know for our process, when applications do come in, then we'll review them on the recruiting side. So I will see the applications that come in for all of them. We do have an applicant tracking system. We have the ability to filter and sort by keywords if we want, but it's not required. And then so we're going to screen all those pieces of information, see if that looks like a good match, and reach out to candidates for more information to clarify some of the details, get all the information in line, and then forward that if that still seems like a good match, then forward that to, on our side is the NIH, where they're considering more of the hiring manager, so they'll review it. But first step in our process are the recruiters who, and Kelly's team for the NIH, all have scientific background, so that way we know exactly what we're looking for.
Okay, and Spencer, do you also use an applicant tracking system? What's an ATS system, and how can one sort of navigate getting past that applicant tracking system?
Yeah, so we definitely use an applicant tracking system for our business. But that being said, we actually work with a whole spectrum of applicant tracking systems with our various clients. So I've actually seen kind of the full gamut of what's available because not every applicant tracking system is right for every company. I think sometimes there's a little bit of misinformation about applicant tracking systems in terms of how they're perceived. There are certainly some, ATS systems, especially for some, larger companies that do have features where they will go through and automatically, refine the candidate pool for you. And they may, there may be certain kind of disqualifier criteria. That being said, that's not the way that we work at Recruitomics with any of our clients. So there's a whole spectrum of that. And I think this gets back to what Susan was saying, a lot of it is keyword based. So it really gets back to kind of the quality of your application materials. Are they comprehensive to, to be recognized in those systems? It's not, there are certainly examples, as I said, of systems that you do kind of have to jump through some hoops and navigate. But for the most part, they're really just a way that a company is able to receive applications, to review their materials, to move them through that hiring pipeline, and having their team being able to work collaboratively together, even more essential today when everybody is working remotely. So an ATS system is actually a really good thing. It actually helps us do a better job as recruiters in terms of follow-up and keeping things moving forward. So, and as I said, there's a huge spectrum of ATS systems, and not all of them are there to strictly filter out your chances of getting that job. In fact, they're really there for us to make sure we're getting the right person for that job. And so, so they're really helpful in that regard. We have a database of over, I think, 45,000 candidates that we maintain at our within our business, but then we also have individual ATS systems for all of our clients that we work with, which we maintain for them as well. So.
Okay. So irrespective of there being an ATS system or one utilizing it or not, it appears that tailoring your resume really makes a difference. Can you speak a little bit about what are the best strategies to tailor a particular resume? You mentioned keywords. What is the strategy that you recommend for all PhDs to create that amazing application package using keywords?
Well, I think that, no resume, there's no perfect resume format, I get frustrated when I see a lot of, the same over and over and over again. So you don't want to copy everyone else. You want to be unique and you want to stand out. There's a balance that needs to be struck between the level of detail and making sure that the detail you're providing is valuable for that role. If it's not, then you can deprioritize that. And that's where the tailoring comes in. You don't need to have a comprehensive CV, for a lot of industry jobs that may be different in other, academic jobs. So, you need to kind of keep in mind what you're applying for. And I'm sure Susan would comment on this. There may be some differences there in what she'd be looking for, but generally I like to see, a list of, key skill sets that are relevant for the role that you feel that you're adept in. I like to see your publications, despite what some advice says to not include those. I like to see them as a scientist recruiter. I'm sure Susan does as well. Those are really informative, and I read those papers to figure out, where your skills lie. So those are important. Do include them. Include, brief descriptions of the specific tasks you were doing. If you were using PCR for something, in what context did you utilize that? That really helps us connect the dots and understand that, you were applying these for specific applications and gives us the so what, so to speak, which we really need to see. So I would say, be wary of having a CV if you're applying to an industry job. Typically a 1 to 2 page resume is completely sufficient for our purposes. And as Susan said, we do a really good job as recruiters to, screen these candidates and get that additional information if we need it to provide to the employer. So it's not essential that everything is there, because we're going to dig and we're going to try and learn more about you through the process. There just needs to be enough that we can qualify you technically and see that you're interested and a good fit for the role. And then from there, we would of course go through the whole interview process, and that's where a lot of those details will get sussed out.
Susan,
Also,
no, go ahead.
there's one other thing, which is translational skills that are not necessarily always technical. I don't necessarily need a list of those. What I'd prefer is an example. So this is where some of those, brief descriptions of even technical duties, you can still, kind of describe ways that you were a leader, or that you were organized, or that, you managed projects or mentored people, right? So those are all things that I would be looking for that let me feel confident that you're technically qualified, but also professionally proficient enough to succeed in the role.
Right, so you don't want to use buzzwords like I'm motivated, but you want to demonstrate motivation by providing a solid example of how you are a motivated human being. Susan, you were nodding at when Spencer said he reads all the publications and you prefer that they're publications. In fact, I have a question from the audience submitted a minute ago about publications. They're wondering that, do you care whether the publication is a first author publication, a second author publication? Is there a preference in view from an employer's point of view? Because she says, my boss wants to add the second author of my PhD paper I have been working on as my co-author, and I want to gauge if it's worth discussing with him. So I guess they're asking, does it matter whether you have first, second, third, fourth publication authorship position?
And so thank you. So with regard to publications, the reason why I was nodding is because we have a fair number of positions that are science administrative positions, and a lot of applicants don't feel the need to add their publications, but in fact that actually is the more important part for the scientific and technical background is most important. So I always encourage people to put the publications no matter what the job is. And as Spencer said, we certainly do read through the publications. A lot of times I personally cross-reference all the publications to make sure that the citations are correct. Mm-hmm. You're surprised how many times you find some errors with regard to either journal name, the formatting. So yes, I cross-reference all the publications just to make sure, because the NIH, I know in our case, does the same. They'll read through them. With regard to first, second, a third author, whatever it is, publications, I know most people may feel the need to lean towards first author publications. I did work with one particular lab over at the NIH, and they asked if they did have middle author publications. They didn't care only about the first author. They wanted someone that's going to be a team player. And so they read through when somebody put in only first author publications, they were leery of having someone join their group because it is a team science approach. And so they were a little bit hesitant to consider that person further, thinking that they were only after first author publication. So they were happy to see when I provided the full CV, yes, that they did have middle author publication. So I don't think, at least in our case at the NIH, they're happy to see a blend of them, especially now with everything being done in a very collaborative environment. They want people that are open to either arrangement.
Okay.
Yeah, if I might add one
Yeah.
other thing about that, because I agree. I think in industry, teamwork is essential because you're really not working towards your own project. You're working toward a common goal. So it's even more of a reason to demonstrate that. One of the key things that I see a lot of people write on their cover letters and resumes is independent worker. That's great, but in industry, that's actually not what we're looking for. So being able to work independently is good, especially these days when we're at home working and being able to motivate yourself to be productive. But that's one thing that we really watch out for is anytime it seems like somebody really wants to own their own project or own their own thing, because that's just not really how it works in industry where it's so highly collaborative and it's a team effort.
Okay. You had mentioned that there is no such thing as a perfect resume. I assume I can extrapolate that to mean that there is no perfect candidate. When you're looking for the standout candidate, what do you see first thing? What is a standout candidate's application material? What does it look like? Spencer, you can go first.
Okay. This gets back to, something that I'm sure you've probably talked about, reusing application materials. Not a lot of people know that, our company actually works with more than 20 companies in the New England area, and they may be applying to different jobs at different websites, but they all are coming to me and my desk. And I can see a lot of the time that people have been applying and using the same materials. Often they're not changing things, but it's also just apparent to me that they're really not putting effort in. It's also hard for me to know what role they're most interested in. So I don't know what role to reach out about and say, hey, we'd like to have a conversation. So it's really important that you convey enough interest in your cover letter. Even if it's not required, please submit one because it's actually really helpful for the recruiter. It may not make it to the hiring manager in all honesty, but it's more important that the recruiter can read into why you're applying and actually believe you want it versus just applying for everything you can possibly see. So, just be cautious of that. It's okay to apply to, broadly to different roles, but do make sure that your materials reflect that position and your motivation to get that role. And then it's easier for us to decide, where your skills are going to be best utilized. So I just think, be reflective of the website, know what the company's doing, know what their mission statements are, read their founding literature, write about that in your cover letter, make it seem like you've done your due diligence. If that can be conveyed in those materials, then I'm absolutely going to have a conversation with you, even if you're not necessarily fully technically qualified, because we're looking for somebody who wants it and who's willing to grow. More often than not, we're not hiring the most qualified candidate technically. We're hiring the one that has the best potential and the best fit in terms of those translational skills and their fit within the team and communication skills.
Okay, and Susan, just to clarify a little bit about the authorship, we had a follow-up question. It's do you kind of look down on co-first author versus solo first author publications, or does that matter?
For me, not necessarily. I don't think that any distinction has been made. I think the NIH is more concerned from what we see that they have a variety, of middle author, first author. The variety I think is what's important to the NIH.
Okay, and I assume the same for you, Spencer. Is like mention it either way. Okay.
Absolutely. And something else just to keep in mind, you don't have to list every paper either. This gets back to tailoring. Sometimes it'll say selected publication, more available. And that lets me know that, oh, these are just 3 that are the most closely related to this job. That's another way you can tailor, and it's obvious to me. And then I can always just look you up on PubMed or whatever to look into those other publications too. But that's just something else, especially if you're concerned about like the size of your resume, if you're applying to an industry position. That can be a good way to save some space because publications can take up quite a bit depending on, how long you've been within academia.
And you mentioned size or length of the resume. Very often when we're reviewing resumes to help students, it's usually a one-page resume for a PhD student, and I always advise them to extend it to a two-page resume. Is that normal? Is that good advice? Don't try to restrict yourself to a one-page resume, because they've been told early on that your resume needs to be one page long. Susan?
Well, for us, we actually encourage, I know it's probably counterintuitive, we encourage more detail as possible, since we're going to submit the information sort of on their behalf too. In our case, the only client we have is the NIH. So that process, they like a lot of detail. It's the federal government, they like a lot of information. So we ask people not to restrict it if they have, research experience, some science administrative experience, maybe they don't need the full CV, but yeah, certainly more detail for us is better. And we do encourage, expensive, select publications if they've been in the field for quite a long time. But yeah, we don't have a limit. The NIH does not restrict us, so we're open to, a couple pages. We don't want it to squeeze into one page, because then sometimes people try to make the font really small and the margin crazy. So yeah, it's something that's easy to read, nice layout, and in our case, they don't necessarily have to be fancy with the formatting.
And Spencer, you mentioned 1 to 2 pages.
Yeah, so there's the difference, between, what you would see in the NIH. It makes sense that they're going to value that level of detail if you think about a bio sketch or something like that, right? Yeah. Within industry, there's a lot of stuff there that we don't necessarily need, because it's just overwhelming amount of detail for our busy hiring managers. Everything moves very quickly within industry. Most of the time when we're hiring, the need was yesterday. And so we don't like to take a ton of time out of our hiring manager's day to review piles and piles. It's our job to really refine that. 1 to 2 pages should be proficient for most people at this stage. I think it's totally fine to go on a second page. I think it needs to be digestible by us as recruiters. If there's no white space, if it's formatted so densely that it's a wall of text, and we see this a lot, the reality is that's very indicative of somebody who has trouble communicating concisely. So that in and of itself can be a deterrent. So be wary of that. Sometimes, at least within industry, less but more pertinent information is better. And I think it's a little bit different than what Susan would encounter. So that's where you really need to just be mindful of where you're applying. Even if you're applying to both, academic and industry jobs, just, be mindful of that and have 2 sets of application materials. It's okay to, be open to different career paths.
Yeah, and know your audience is pretty much the crux of what you're saying. Know your audience. Given you sort of researching your audience, a question from our audience today is, should we mention our interests on our resume or our CVs, like our outside interests? I assume that means outside interests like hobbies or whatnot. What do you recommend for people who want to include that on their application materials? Start with Susan and then Spencer.
In terms of for anybody that wants to mention outside interest, sometimes we caution against that. We've had instances where people want to put things that may be considered, a little outside the box or controversial. So we try to tell our candidates to keep it just to the, relevant materials. We realize that people do have outside interests and hobbies, and maybe that may come up during the course of an interview part if it's appropriate. But on first glance, we just tell people to sort of stick to the material that's relevant to the position they're applying for.
Mm. And what about in industry, Spencer?
We're a little bit more open to it. We because of the kind of team focus, sometimes that can actually be what connects, a hiring manager with a potential new hire. Maybe they're both interested in tennis, right, or whatever it is. You do need to keep it, PG. This is a potential employer. It needs to be representing you in a professional light. So do keep that in mind. I've seen some really, really crazy things. Sometimes they're really interesting and makes me want to learn more. Other times it is a little bit like, oh, I'm not sure I would have included that. So just use your best judgment. But don't focus a lot of time and attention on that. We're not judging you by those. That's certainly not a criteria that I as a recruiter use. It's maybe more beneficial for the hiring manager to be like, oh, cool, I see that they're also into this, same thing that I'm into. But it could go the other way. Maybe they really don't like what you are interested in. I don't think typically that would be a reason that they should be making decisions, and I don't think that's really the case. But it is just one of those other personal bits of information that you don't have to share. So please don't feel expected to do that. It's really, you know, up to you if you want to share those things.
Okay. And in terms of, you mentioned cover letters. I read an article that cover letters are dead. People don't use it anymore. People don't read it anymore. But clearly you said add one anyway, even if it's not being asked for. How long should a cover letter be? The question from the audience is, my sense is that the trend is to have it shorter, 2 to 3 paragraphs, rather than academic style long messaging. So for industry, let's start with industry. What's your recommendation for how long a cover letter should be?
No more than 1 page, because as I said, a lot of the, more so just don't, do put effort into it, but know that, you know, a lot of hiring processes, they just don't get that far down the line, but I do read them. And I think there's one thing I can clarify in terms of a cover letter can actually be the email too, you know, as you're applying. If that's the mechanism you're applying, that's sufficient. You know, we enter all of that information into our ATS system so that I can see that, oh, they wrote a lovely email when they applied for this. And so it looks like they really want it. You know, it's really for me to just feel like you put in that extra effort. It makes it clear to me that, you know, this isn't just a resume that you're submitting everywhere again. So yeah, I don't think it needs to be longer than that. I think you should be able to convey your interest within that amount of space, or a brief email, just something more than just attaching a resume to an email or uploading it.
And with you, Susan, I don't remember submitting a cover letter, but with Kelly, I remember after the fact, after my resume had gone through, I had to fill up some essay type questions. Is that usually the normal process for government?
For our process through Kelly at the NIH, we don't necessarily need a cover letter. Sometimes our applicant tracking system doesn't really have a good space to put a separate cover letter. So we've had some creative candidates that will have one file where the first page of it is the cover letter, and then their second page will be the resume all in one Word file, or PDF. So that's one way to do it, and we'll read them. You know, use it to gauge general interest, but our process for Kelly at the NIH specifically is that we'll have to reach out to Ken to get more details, and we'll sort of build a cover letter together that's focused specifically on the job. So that way, because our process is to send over resumes to the hiring manager with a brief summary of skills and experience, roughly our case about 200 words. So sometimes if people have prepared a cover letter, I can use that information, but otherwise I'll reach out to them to get the very specific details and narrow it down to just fit in our space. But if they want to put a cover letter, that's fine, and we'll use it. A lot of times, as Spencer indicated, I'll use it as just a good way to see people's writing skills.
Yeah.
Okay. You'd both mentioned that you go ahead, go the extra mile and read people's publications and cross-reference. Speaking of going the extra mile, are you also looking at people's LinkedIn profiles when you get an application? What about people's other social media like Facebook, Instagram, and everything like that? Can you shed some behind-the-scenes light on how that works, Susan?
For us, certainly for LinkedIn, we don't necessarily, in our group, necessarily use too much on other social media platforms, but LinkedIn is certainly a big platform, and we do cross-reference the information that appears on LinkedIn profiles, only because we have learned in some cases the hard way that the NIH will also do the same, and so we don't want to have any surprises when we get to the interview and discussion that we see, you know, the NIH will reference something that appears on their LinkedIn profile that does not appear anywhere else, or some inconsistencies with dates. We find that people don't always have the same dates of employment on their profile as on the resume that they submitted. So yes, for consistency, we always do double check, but personally, we don't do anything else with other social media platforms because Kelly doesn't really have that as part of their policy to be able to cross-reference, you know, Twitter or Facebook. We don't do that.
What about for Spencer?
So we operate almost our entire business off of LinkedIn. So it's essential these days, especially now that a lot of us are working virtually. That is your mechanism for networking. So definitely, you know, Susan says it's important. I'm saying it's important. It's important. You know, I wish that we weren't all tied to a social media platform for that, but it really is a great way to boost your career. So do spend some time. Do make sure it matches your resume. so that we don't have any concerns there. We do also do a general search in terms of your kind of online presence. And so this is a matter of Google searching. We're going to search for you, and we're going to look up everything that we can find. This is just generally, you know, number one, to make sure that things are appropriate, but also that there's no major, you know, HR red flags that could potentially be a disqualifier. So, you know, you do want to make sure that you're represented well online. That's really important. We also will potentially do, you know, background checks if we are proceeding to make an offer. This is not, you know, a hard rule with all of our clients. Some, you know, non-public clients, non-public companies, it's less emphasized, but once a company goes public, they very likely will do a thorough background check with every hire they make, because it's essential that they make sure that there's no sort of controversies that may arise in the future.
You both mentioned the importance of LinkedIn, so I think this is a good segue to ask you, when people apply on LinkedIn, you probably get hundreds of requests as recruiters for connection on LinkedIn. So what do you think is the most meaningful way to engage with you as a recruiter on LinkedIn? And then on the flip side, what is one way to sort of ruin a relationship with the recruiter so that they'll never look at your application materials ever again? So let's start with, what's a good way to meaningfully engage with you guys? Spencer?
Well, I will most of the time accept anybody who adds me. I really appreciate when someone takes the time to, you know, send me a few notes in that invite about, you know, why they want to connect. It's helpful to me to know that. I get, you know, requests from people all over the world, and sometimes I'm not really sure, you know, what they're interested in. And so if I have some idea, then it can help me be more effective. If I know you're looking for jobs in neuroscience, then as soon as you add me, I can add your, you know, details to our database, add a note that you're looking for specific types of roles. And then, you know, that can be really helpful to me as it is you. So I appreciate that insight. A lot of folks do make asks of me on LinkedIn, and that's not a thing that is necessarily a problem. It's just to be aware that we are exceptionally busy, and you know, we are working for these other clients, and I'm limited in my, you know, time to do specific favors to individuals. I'll try my best as I can, but just be aware that you know, be aware of what you're asking, and make sure that you're providing, you know, value. I don't mind networking at all, but make sure it's not all one-sided in terms of your ask. You know, I tend to be willing to go the extra mile if somebody is, you know, shows genuine interest in my career, who wants to learn more, or, you know, is able to add value to our connection somehow. And that goes across the board, I think, for any networking relationship. You want to make sure that you're both able to provide some value there. You know, so maybe that's, you know, I read your paper, I'm really interested in, you know, that work, or, you know, I see you're working with this company, you know, I'd love to learn more about it. Those sort of things. So I think that's just across the board.
Okay, so the one way to not engage in meaningful conversation is to have it be one-sided and not to provide value. Susan, what about you in terms of people reaching out? Usually when there's a job posting on LinkedIn, and then if someone applies for that job posting, is it recommended to follow up with the recruiter who posted that job, or track down a recruiter and follow up and say, hey, I applied through LinkedIn Jobs, or I applied through the website? Is that acceptable to do?
Certainly that's fine for us. We, you know, for positions that we post through LinkedIn, sometimes I'll get the application, and then I'll also get a connection request like right behind it. So that's fine. It's a good way for me to keep track. At least I know that those are the people that are really, really interested. I'll keep, you know, that way it's certainly good. The only thing that really is hard for us is when sometimes people will send me a message and ask that I forward their profile to the hiring manager. That's not our process. So that's the one thing that becomes a little challenging, is people just ask that we'll just keep forwarding their profile to people, and I don't have that luxury to do that. So they have to sort of follow the process. I know sometimes people don't necessarily like that when I reply back, that they have to sort of go through the normal steps, but no, at least that's fine for me if people have applied for a position and then follow it up with a message or request to connect. And then usually I'm, you know, read through all the requests that, as Spencer said, you know, it's great to put a message in there, that way I'll know what you're interested in and what sort of brought you to my profile. That way I'll be able to keep track for when new jobs come up, in case they haven't seen it, then I can reach out to them.
Okay.
I had one other thing to note on that, which was that sometimes people will, you know, after I will have spoken with them on the phone about a specific role, I get people that will try and ask for status updates via LinkedIn. Please do not do that. That is not a good way to get information from us. We work with a big team. We have a team approach to everything.
Oh, did he mute out? Spencer got cut off. So Susan, until Spencer comes back, I'll ask you, when it comes to the LinkedIn process again, Spencer was about to say, like, don't follow up about the status of a job. So what do you suggest? How does one follow up about the status of a job application?
I didn't know. Oh, I didn't know. Oh, okay. I didn't know if Spencer was alluding to the fact that sometimes we've had, like, I've had normal, you know, sort of traditional email conversations, and then sometimes people, if they haven't gotten a response through my normal email, then they'll try LinkedIn. I didn't know if that's what he was alluding to, is that people try to use the LinkedIn feature as a sort of a secondary avenue to get the information. So I know I tell, for the candidates that have applied for positions, I usually try at the onset to give them a sense that, you know, maybe it won't have an update for a week or week and a half, you know, and ask them to check in. So I usually sort of set that timeline when I have initial conversations that try to set the expectation of what I know is going to probably happen, or at least what we've experienced historically, that it's going to take us a week or maybe it's into 10 days before we'll hear back. And then certainly if they haven't heard an update, you know, follow up with me by email. So that's usually what I outline as our process during the initial screening.
Okay. We'll wait till Spencer comes back to hear an industry perspective later. But in the meanwhile, can you tell me if it's okay to connect with a recruiter if I'm in my second or first year of my PhD and build that relationship, or should I be connecting when I'm at the peak of my job? That was a question submitted from a student as well.
I think it's great to start, maybe to start the process as early as possible. I know we have had a fair amount of people that come to us, you know, at the later stage of their postdoc, and they're realizing that they're, you know, a little bit strapped for in terms of position, and that their postdoc will end, and that's, you know, gives us the impression a little bit of urgency. So we don't always know how to be able to help right then and there. So if there's certainly that relationship, that's very, very important to us. You know, maybe it's not necessarily the first year of their PhD or postdoc. Maybe it's just at the second year as they're thinking about what's going to happen. Because I know that for us, sometimes by the time that people are into their third year of their postdoc, then they really have to figure out the sort of the career path. So yes, that's a great for us, is to build that relationship. That way we know, you know, what types of positions they might be interested in. They can also start to take a look at the types of positions that we have. They can, you know, sort of focus their own experience and see what kind of experience they'll need to gain if they're trying to target a particular position, especially if it's one away from the bench.
Welcome back, Spencer. Thanks for that, Susan. Our question is, how do you explain gaps in your employment on your CV? Do you do that when you're, do you do that on your resume, or do you wait until you have a call with a recruiter?
Oh, and for me,
yeah.
In terms of gaps, that's always a tricky question. If someone is able to, if they have gaps on their resume, but, you know, have been able to fill it in maybe with some other volunteer experiences, you know, that way I don't personally encourage anybody to put, you know, sort of details on their resume about the gaps. You know, we leave that certainly to be discussed during an interview, with things that people want to disclose at that point. You know, sometimes they're not required to disclose that kind of personal information, but if it's something that they want to fill in those gaps with other volunteer experiences that they have, things they can be a little bit creative about how to fill in those gaps, that's fine. But certainly it's important in our case to tell, in terms of the recruiter, that they'll want to know that kind of information. That way we just have a clear understanding of their career path. But in terms of interviews and going forward, you know, that's up to them if they want to disclose some additional details, but certainly good to help for the recruiter to know what has happened for their whole career path.
Okay. Spencer, you good?
Yeah, sorry, we've lost the whole internet in our house, so I'm connected on my phone. So I apologize. I don't know what's going on at the moment.
Okay, I'm glad you're with us. Can I ask you, Spencer, like one of the questions from the audience was, what is the best way to market my PhD into an industry position when I don't have industry experience?
Yeah, that's a really, a question that we get a lot. So, one thing to note is that there's a lot of different entry points for industry careers. You don't necessarily have to have a PhD to end up being, a principal scientist further down the line, because you can gain experience within industry. There are certain, employers or positions that may emphasize the need for prior industry experience more so than others. That typically is when the role requires you to really hit the ground running, or already have a basis of knowledge of how the process works, whether that's drug or device or whatever within the life sciences. It's a different way of working within industry as compared with academia. And so sometimes there will be a requirement that experience is there, and that's usually noted within the job descriptions. So if it's asking for 2 or 3 years industry experience, it's not, you could, let's say it was a PhD plus that experience. If you had a postdoc, you might be able to apply. It may still be a stretch, frankly, because if they note that you need industry experience, quite often they may hold you to that. That being said, we hire a lot of roles which we're specifically looking for entry level, folks who are straight out of a PhD or with a postdoc. So I don't know how much advice I can provide in terms of making yourself more attractive, because there's no point in lying about that, but I do think that there are other, and this may be more challenging in our current environment, but there are opportunities for you to at least gain more insight into how industry, science, and research and development works. And so the greater representation you have of the way that process works, and if you can communicate that with us through your application materials and through our discussion, then I think that that's usually enough. I think it's not so much trying to make yourself have something you don't. It's really just targeting the roles that are looking for somebody that doesn't necessarily have prior industry experience. And usually those are positions that you're going to be joining an existing team. You're not going to be the first person in a company straight out of a PhD typically. And that's just to make sure that you're able to succeed and have the framework of support there to onboard you to a different style of work.
For the audience, please feel free to add your questions that you may have as we're talking into the chat box. Susan, what about if a job lists master's required and I'm a PhD? Is it okay to apply for like master's level positions when I have a PhD, or can I apply and then ask if there are any roles available for me as a PhD? What do you recommend for people who are just applying for when it says PhD required?
Right, so we certainly have that a fair amount where the job posting will say a master's degree and a couple of years experience. So sometimes we'll have a PhD level scientist or applicant, so certainly that's fine. The only caution we have is that sometimes when the job, all the time when the job is posted that way, that's an indication of what sort of salary can be supported. So sometimes for PhD scientists or some of our other PhD level applicants are looking for a set salary that job posting that says master's in a couple of years just not going to be able to support. So certainly we are open and flexible. We have just a couple of times that maybe that the NIH is really picky about the degree that someone will possess, but most of the time it's going to come down for sort of salary expectations. And sometimes even when we talk further, they'll realize that when it says master's in a couple of years, that the job is a little bit too junior for what they're looking for. So, but certainly no problem on our end if people want to apply.
Okay. And so you just mentioned salary and all that stuff. Can you walk us through working with a recruiter? What does the life cycle look like? Like for you, for example, you and I, we spoke and then you were there, the interview as well, all the way through. Is that normal for like recruiters to work through the entire process of application, interview, negotiation, offers? Or does that responsibility shift to hiring manager eventually down the line? What's your process?
Right, for our process, exactly as you have seen. So our arrangement, I think, is a little bit, maybe a little bit unique with regard to Kelly's operation at the NIH, in that we do have the initial screening, and then we're there part of the interview process, and then we take care of for the offer and the negotiation, that kind of thing. So we do all of that. The part that may be a little bit unique is the interview part. Some of our clients that Kelly works with, they'll do all the screening and things, but then the candidate will go to the interview by themselves and then sort of just report back to the recruiter they have, depending on the arrangement with the client. But in our case, that we do participate in the interview process, but everything else is pretty standard, that we'll take care of the negotiation and the onboarding.
Okay. And Spencer?
It's a little different. I wanted to go back to the last question just briefly, in that, one thing that we see a lot is PhD students and above applying for roles that only require a master's. And we immediately, for most of these roles, we won't actually consider you because you're kind of undervaluing your credentials. And that causes major issues in terms of internal equity within our companies. We only work with small companies, so it wouldn't be fair for us to bring in a PhD in a role that was really for someone with a master's degree. Meanwhile, there's PhDs getting paid more, that would cause culture issues within the company. So typically, it's okay to apply because maybe there's some flexibility in terms of title, but do not feel bad if you do not hear back about that, because it's more likely that you're just applying for a role that you're overqualified for. So that's, just one thing to keep in mind. Make sure you know what level you are applying, what's the entry level or title for you at this company, and there's variations. So some companies, will hire somebody, let's say at the scientist level with a master's, that's the entry point. Others are hiring PhDs as scientists. So read the job descriptions because they will be specific to that company. Every company has a slightly different kind of hierarchy and titling framework, and this can vary immensely. We get a lot of PhDs applying to research associate positions, but those are positions we typically would hire somebody with a bachelor's. Yeah. So, just be aware of that, because a research associate within academia can be a PhD position. So, just read those job descriptions, because, don't just do a blanket title search and expect that all of those are going to be correct. In terms of the next question, in terms of our workflow, we quite often are not there during the interview on site. Our team is, for the most part, completely remote. Being said, I do go on site for certain events, for like co-op interview days or something like that, when it's kind of chaotic and they need a bit of organization. But for the most part, we kind of are your main contact point throughout the process, even through to offer. We're kind of that objective person you can reach out to with questions that isn't necessarily your hiring manager. And so that's kind of the role that we serve, and we prefer it that way, just because we're not the ones that are involved in that kind of interview or final judgment process, and that at least maintains our good relationship with that candidate, because we hire for 20+ companies. It's very likely we're going to encounter them again in the future, and so this enables us to really strengthen that position. And so I guess it's a little bit different from what Susan does, but it's, again, a different environment entirely. So so that's just kind of how our framework works. But I think other recruiting firms may have people that are present for some of these interviews. That's just our case.
Before I ask the audience questions that are being submitted, I want to touch upon an important topic, and that's international folks who are applying now in uncertain times. They don't know what's happening with their OPT, their visas. What can you sort of share with us about hiring practices right now in COVID-19 and for international students? Let's go with Susan first and then Spencer.
Okay, great, thank you. And so our group, like I said, is dedicated to the NIH, and we have been extremely busy. We actually have more work than we can handle, and so we've had to outsource and get some help from some of our other offices across the country. So we have a ton of work that needs to be done, and so that's the positive part. And then in terms of international applications, we certainly have our fair number, and the NIH and Kelly, they're certainly able to support a variety of work authorization statuses. The one challenge we do run into, OPT is not an issue. The challenge we do run into on the Kelly side is with the STEM extension. So if anybody does have OPT, that's completely fine. But then in our arrangement, we would need to then proceed to apply for H-1B visa. The STEM extension is a bit of a challenge for our agreement, only because we're not a for the training component, we don't have the ability to have a training plan, which is necessary for the STEM extension. So that part is the only part that becomes a problem, but we have a fair amount of scientists and science professionals from around the world. So really not an issue. The only thing is that we do, it's sort of position by position if the NIH will allow funding for that. So some of our highly specialized positions, it's a little bit easier to campaign for that. But otherwise, certainly is, and then the other benefit for Kelly at the NIH is that with regard to H-1B visas, that we are exempt from the cap regulations. So that helps our cause that we can apply for H-1B visas at any time throughout the year because the placement is going to be at a federal facility. So that part we're exempt from the cap regulations.
Yeah, and Spencer?
So a little bit different. So you can see kind of compare and contrast. I mean, I'm encouraged by this just because, even hearing that for me, it just shows that there are various opportunities and venues you can go. So we, with OPT, we really don't struggle with OPT at all. Even with STEM OPT, that's something that we can pretty easily do. We are very familiar with those processes, and we really guide a lot of our clients who are very small companies through the process of, becoming E-verified so that they can take on OPT trainees, developing training plans so that we can make sure that there is that strong framework, which is required. And so we do a really good job of making sure that that's all set up. One difficulty is just the turnaround times in terms of the past few months. Obviously, there's been a lot of shutdowns, and so that's caused a little bit of issue, but there's no major issue. There are some companies that simply don't become E-verified, unfortunately, and we can't convince them for whatever reason. And that's just the way that it goes. We have to go with what our clients' policies are. But in general, I would say most of our clients are very happy to take on OPT trainees because it's a great mechanism for them to get great talent, entry-level talent. So, without having to go through some of those other visa processes. Where we do struggle is with H-1Bs. So that's an area that not only is it extremely limited in terms of what's available, especially depending on what country you are from, but also the timeline for processing a new H-1B is incredibly long. It's more than a year typically. So, if we're interviewing you now and we need you now, that just puts the company in a really hard position. So, please know that it's not that they don't want to, it's just that it's a challenge. So there are other mechanisms like maybe an O-1 visa. If you're a good candidate for that, that is something that we do quite frequently. All of our clients typically take advantage of expedited processing. So that can be one of the quickest options depending on your education and background. And, generally I would say it's really important that you do communicate with, International Students Office, immigration attorneys. You need to figure out what your options are, and you need to be proactive about it, because the worst thing that can happen is, not being prepared or not knowing that, you're going to need to do things proactively. And so just have a good understanding of what your options are. And then in terms of the companies, you just have to work through the process and identify which ones would support that. But we encourage most of our clients to do so when they can, and it's the right candidate. We're required to make sure that we've gone through the full gamut of other candidates in these cases. That's a requirement of us. But if you have the right credentials and are the best fit, then we are absolutely happy to make that happen. And in terms of costs and things like that, that's usually not the biggest barrier. And so one thing that I would, really advise folks that might be going through this, don't undersell yourself. I've had people that said, oh, I'll take less money, if you sponsor me. Don't do that. That's not how it really works. That's not how we would never pay you lesser than somebody at the same level just because there were additional steps to take to hire you. So don't feel like that's something that you should be doing. And if a company is recommending that that's what they want to do, I would question whether that's really an employer you want to work with. Good
point. Spencer, how are your companies hiring practice, ensuring a diverse and inclusive group of applicants? That's a question.
So that's a fantastic question. That's actually one of the things I think utilizing a recruitment service can be really great, and that, we kind of prevent a lot of that kind of information that could be open to some sort of innate bias or anything like that. We do not include that in the notes that we provide to our hiring managers. Much like Susan, we do write up a brief set of notes to go along with a resume. And even if somebody during our screening call notes, that they have, 3 kids or whatever, none of that goes on to them, right? We don't want that information to be a factor. I also would encourage people not to include photos on their resumes because those do go on to hiring managers. There's no reason they need to have that. It's fine to have it on LinkedIn, but we filter all of that information out when we pass that on to the hiring managers to make sure that that's not the case. And we really actively try to make sure that for each client that we're working with, that we are actively aware of what our demographics look like and what they need to look like. And so sometimes we join a company that's been around for a while and we look at the team and we say, hey, is this something that you've thought about? Because it looks like maybe you need to work on this. Whereas others, we're starting from the get-go. So we're making sure that we're mindful of our team demographics as we grow. And that's really the ideal, because that's where your culture is founded in those early days. So, and I think that, a biotech company that's just starting up, a lot of these people are scientists. They are not HR people. They may not be thinking about these things, but it's important. And that's where a recruiting firm really actually can help guide them and make sure that they're keeping that in mind as they go through their talent acquisition process.
Okay, I do want to get to the questions in the chat box in the last few minutes. Some of the questions I think I can answer about the resume and CV, but let's go with the question here from Denise, who says some online applications require you to put a desired salary in. Is it better to put the salary in like 000, or should we specify a range? Spencer?
So, we cannot actually, ask you what you're currently making, at least here in Massachusetts. That may vary in other states. So, when we're asking that, most of the time we're looking to make sure that it's within the realm of feasibility in terms of budget. If your expectations are unreasonable, then it's not worth us wasting your time. Different companies compensate differently. The packages vary. So, if you have true expectations of what you are looking to make, it's fine to share that. But know that, I think for an entry level, it's good to perhaps be a little bit more flexible, because there's always room for negotiation. So my recommendation in these cases, if you can write open to any competitive offer. That's really a great way. Not all of those fields will let you do that, but that's just one way to kind of skirt that. But also, it's not a bad idea to do a little research about, where you're looking to work. What is the cost of living there? What are your needs? I think we typically don't look at, current compensation with an entry-level hire as any indication of what we should be paying somebody, especially because we all know that a lot of academics are not paid well. So that's something that, would not be a factor, but it is something to think about, because if you do have specific needs, then you want those to be known. So I guess I would say it's great to be flexible for entry level if you're really looking to get your foot in the door, because that means that at least you can continue to entertain that and then end up negotiating later on. But if it's a true hard line that you have, maybe you've received another offer, that's fine to share, because if you have received another offer, that's really helpful for me to know, because then I can say, we need to move quickly, or we need to offer more. Can we do it? It really helps me work with the employer to make sure that it's something that we can make you happy.
Yeah, and the question was, will that number ever be used against you if you inadvertently lowball? So you want to make sure that you don't lowball yourself as well, right? And state a number. So we'll be doing research about what people get paid in that area, can help leverage that conversation when time comes as well, right?
To some extent, I would just be wary of some of the sites that are available. They're good to look at: Glassdoor, salary.com, all those things, fine to look at, but just be aware that titles as I said, you know, a research associate within academia is very different from a research associate within industry in terms of their work, their level, their compensation. So, and I don't think there's a lot of kind of breakdown that's happening on those sites. So just be aware of that. There's also some people that may have the title of scientist, but they've been working for the same company for 15 years. They started there as an intern, right? And they've climbed their way up, and their salary may be way higher than, you know, what an incoming scientists may be making, because they've been loyally working for that company for a long time.
Yeah.
So do not be too hard line on those values that you're seeing on those websites. Use them as a general guide, but and the ranges they show are true ranges. If you're looking at the high end, that's probably somebody who has a unique situation or has been there for a while, or is at a company where that title is actually at a much higher level. Mm-hmm. So just be aware of that, because we've had a lot of people who come into the negotiation being very hard lined on specific values, and that absolutely can ruin a relationship with an employer. And we do withdraw offers for people who are negative or who are really, really aggressive in terms of their what they're looking compensation wise, because we will offer you the same as what we would offer anybody at that level. We are not going to lowball you compared to other team members. As I said, internal equity is essential in a small company to maintain culture. So there is room for negotiation, but again, we would never bring you in based on your qualifications above somebody else at your same level in qualifications. Okay. So, but there are other things that can, you know, make that a little bit more blurry. Say you did an additional summer course on regulatory affairs or something that boosts you above somebody else, or you did an extra year or 6 months of postdoc, you know, so there is some wiggle room there.
Okay. Some of these questions, honestly, I will answer separately in an email because lack of time, it's very easy. I know the answers to those questions, but let me get one last question from Morgan. She says, if some industries have entry-level jobs that are suited for people right out of PhD or postdoc who don't have industry experience, how will I be able to get an industry experience if I'm still currently completing my PhD or my postdoc? So again, I think it goes with the whole notion that you mentioned, Spencer, is like, if I don't have experience, how do I showcase that I have experience? And in that case, you're saying, speak to your strengths that you already have and showcase your relational, translational skill set as well.
Yes, and there are some other things that you can be doing even from the comfort of your own homes right now. There are job simulations that are available. I know I shared these with you, Rajni, a couple weeks ago. So there are job simulations where you can actually try doing various tasks that are relevant to different roles in research and regulatory affairs and consulting, what you name it. They also have these available for the humanities and other fields beyond science. I know there's a few in the audience. So hopefully you can share that maybe after the call, because I think that's a great resource. Even if it's not something you're going to, you know, fill up your resume with, you can still say, oh, you know, I've been looking to go into industry for a long time. Like, I've been doing these online job simulations to give me a sense of what work would look like in these various roles so that I can learn more. Just showing that you're kind of educating yourself about what it's going to be like is better than just saying, yes, I want to work in industry. One of the things that I think is most frustrating to me is people say, you know, academia or industry, but within each, there is such a diversity of roles. I think it's really important to explore what you actually are most interested in. Industry is not a job. You know, a bench scientist or an immunologist or whatever, that's something. Or maybe you don't want to be on the bench anymore and you want to go into business development or something like that. There's such diversity. So explore that, know what you're interested in so that you can talk about it, convey that. You know, I think if you just generalize it to industry, it's also not clear, you know, where your career aspirations are. Are you looking to be a research leader, or are you looking to be a business leader or something like that? So think about that, and you know, make sure that those are known, because